Welcome to the first devlog for my Pokemon Rumble remake project in Godot. Before we start, I want to make one thing very clear. This is not intended to be a perfect one-to-one recreation of the original Wii game. I'm making this project because I loved Pokemon Rumble growing up, and I thought it would be a fun way to learn more about game development, Godot, and how the original game was put together. The goal is to capture the feeling of Pokemon Rumble, while also having fun experimenting and learning along the way. Depending on how things go, I might even release the project in the future, but that is to be determined later. Alright, so to get started, I created a new Godot project called Pokemon Rumble Remake. I set up a GitHub repository with the same name, and I cloned it locally. I also made some little folders in the Godot project to keep everything organized, because I feel like that would help me later on. Since I'm using files extracted from the original game, I made sure those files were excluded through the git ignore, so none of the original game assets would end up in the repository. You know, because copyright or whatever. I opened the Pokemon Rumble WAD in Show Me WADs and extracted the contents into a new folder. This gave me a collection of .app files, and after some investigation, I found that most of the game's assets were stored inside of the 5th .app file. After unpacking that file as a U8 archive, I was left with a huge number of compressed files. To deal with those, I used a tool called LZH8_CMPDEC08. Honestly, I have no idea where I originally found this program, but it works, so it will be linked alongside the other tools in the video description. After running a batch decompression script, I used bulk rename utility to clean up the file names to make everything a little easier to work with. Using Brawlcrate, I opened the archives, extracted their contents, and started looking through the BRRES files that contained models, textures, and animations. I spent a while just browsing through the game's assets and loading animations in the BRRES viewer. Along the way, I even found a few things that don't seem to appear in the final game. One of the most useful parts of this process was exporting the model, texture, and animation data in bulk. BRRES viewer let me export everything as PNG, PSK, and PSA files, which could then be imported directly into Blender using the Unreal PSK/PSA add-on. The first Pokemon I imported was Rattata, because that's the first Pokemon you start as. After fixing up the materials and assigning the correct textures, I saved the blend file directly into the Godot project and imported it as its own scene. This is around the time where I opened up the original game on the second monitor so I could constantly compare my work against the source material. With an actual Pokemon in the engine, I started building some of the game's structure. I created a Pokemon class and began adding data such as HP, attack, defense, speed, types, and moves. I also created some early versions of the level and terminal classes to prepare for loading the stages later on. The next major asset I tackled was the first terminal. After importing it into Blender, I spent a while fixing the materials and assigning textures. For some reason, there was an entire duplicate copy of the terminal hidden underneath the actual one, which was a fun discovery. Once everything looked correct, I imported it into Godot and started fixing texture issues through material overrides. While working on the environment, I created a simple shader that combined the grass texture with its overlay texture. The same shader also ended up being useful for recreating details like the lines in the metallic flooring. For the moment, I also added a placeholder decal until I could locate the original texture later. At that point, it was finally time to start making something playable. I began working on the player controller by creating a collision cylinder that was roughly the same size as the one used in the original game. I attached a simple movement script, added a camera, and immediately noticed that everything was way too dark. To fix that, I added a spotlight above the player similar to the one used in the original game. I also added the proper movement inputs, created a directional light for the terminal, and adjusted the project settings until the shadows looked much closer to the original Wii version. Then came what was probably one of the most frustrating tasks so far, recreating the black outlines around objects. I spent a long time trying different shader approaches before eventually realizing that the outline wasn't actually broken. The problem was that I needed to merge vertices by distance in Blender. Once I did that, the outline started looking way better. After getting the outline shader functioning, I spent some time trying to match the camera angle from the original game. At first, I was mostly guessing, but eventually I got close enough to continue working. I also added rotation logic so the Pokemon would face the direction it was moving. Next, I imported the animation data into Blender and re-imported the Pokemon. Back in Godot, I found the animation player node and hooked everything up to the movement system. For the first time, the Pokemon could actually move around and animate correctly. With movement working, collision became the next problem. The original terminal model contains a lot of complex geometry, and using that directly led to constant snagging and a weird collision. To solve that, I manually created a simplified collision mesh in Blender. It took a little while, but it gave me far more predictable movement and eliminated most of the issues. After that, I started separating the glowing rings around the levels, so I could eventually make them light up when a stage is completed. While searching through the game's files for the correct decal texture, I accidentally found the original camera's coordinates, which meant I no longer had to keep guessing where the camera should be positioned. Eventually, I found the decal texture I was looking for, along with the Battle Royale sign texture that I completely forgot existed. Since the sign glows in the original game, I experimented with the material overrides until it looked reasonably close. Around this point, I also discovered Godot's world environment system. Adding one instantly improved the overall look of the scene, and made the glowing effects stand out much more. I also changed the Pokemon materials from per pixel lighting to per vertex lighting. It turns out the more simple shading style actually looks much closer to the original Wii game, so that's something I'll need to remember when importing future assets. Speaking of things I needed to remember, I finally replaced the placeholder floor decal with the proper texture. I still don't really understand how decals are supposed to work, so right now I'm cheating a little and overlaying the texture directly onto the floor using a shader. It's not perfect, and it introduces some issues with the outline shader disappearing in certain spots, but that's a problem for future me. And finally, as a little reward for making it this far, I started implementing shiny Pokemon. It's still a work in progress, but seeing the game slowly come together has been incredibly satisfying. What started as a simple idea to explore the original game's assets has already turned into a playable prototype with imported models, animations, movement, lighting, shaders, and the beginnings of an actual game system. There's still a huge amount left to do, but for a first devlog, I'm really happy with the progress so far.